Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this third day of the History and Philosophy of Cosmology conference. And I'm happy today to introduce our speaker, David Pankenier, with a talk about ancient Chinese astronomy and cosmology. So a tour d'horizon. So please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. This is going to be rather different than what you've been hearing. I thought it best to, since the Chinese background, the history of astronomy and astrology and cosmology in China is so poorly known in the West, I thought I would give you a tour d'horizon, as I said, initially covering the first 3,000 years or so of Chinese development in this area. We're going to start in the early Neolithic in China. As you'll see, some of the most surprising developments occurred there, anticipating what would come later. I'm not going to dwell on this for the moment, but Nathan Sivan is probably one of the best known elder statesmen in the area of Chinese cosmology. Oops. Here we have something that was discovered only about 3 or 4 decades ago. Rather exciting discovery. This is a jade turtle with a plaque that was discovered in northeast China. And as you can see, the dome-like carapace of the turtle and the plastron, the belly shell, enclosed this plaque with arrow-like figures pointing in the cardinal and intercardinal directions, and an emblem or a symbol in the center, which occurs very often and is generally taken to represent the sun. So here you have a very early graphic attempt, which is interpreted, of course, as a cosmographic map of the world. And we'll see shortly that the turtle comes to play a very important role in these representations and concepts of the structure of the cosmos. Not long after, you have this discovery of a Yangshao culture burial, also in the northeast of China, in eastern Shandong, of what I refer to as a cosmo priest burial. As you'll see in a moment, he's surrounded by acolytes who were sacrificial victims. On the east side, you have a mussel shell mosaic of a dragon, and on the west, a tiger. This is truly extraordinary. This is anticipating by 3,000 years the Chinese conception, iconic creatures of the cardinal directions. The dragon representing the riverine east, and I'll have more to say about dragons in a moment, and the tiger representing the inland mountainous west. Even more interesting, perhaps, is the alignment of the tomb probably best, original alignment probably best reflected in the northern wall, which is about 5 degrees east of north. Given the earthquakes and other disturbances that are possible concerning the skeleton and so on, we don't know if this 10-degree offset was original or not. But if you correct for the 5-degree offset here, as I note, this strangely oblique skeleton of an acolyte points to the winter solstice sunrise. And this is now here, 3000 BCE. Here you have, from the Han Dynasty, about 100 BCE, Eve tiles representing the 4 iconic creatures of the cardinal directions: the dragon, the tiger, this turtle and snake figure, and a bird, the so-called vermilion bird, representing the south, north, and east and west. So in anticipation in the Neolithic, by 3,000 years of this conception of the directions and the cosmos. Next, I wanted to show you this, another truly extraordinary discovery, which is about only 3 decades old, of a so-called observational platform or spirit terrace, Lehigh, which consists of a number of, well, actually 12 apertures facing the northeast and southeast, designed to capture the sunrise at particular dates. Well, actually, the design was probably rather more primitive. As you can see, as we'll see in a moment, one of the first of the apertures captures nothing at all, and there are 12 altogether. So one can speculate that this was an attempt to perhaps reconcile the lunar calendar with a solar calendar, particularly because we know now that at about this date, there was also a 10-month solar calendar in use. But this, of course, is conjecture. The designers, the engineers, missed the arc of the sunrise on the eastern horizon to the north and the south. Here, of course, they had to add additional apertures. So it's a rather interesting experiment in designing the calendar. Here you have the data, and shows clearly that this slot captured neither the moon nor the sun at its southernmost extreme. And there's a tremendous variation, tremendous variation in the span of time between sunrise in the successive apertures. So one could also conjecture that the builders were not aware that the sun's movement along the horizon changed rather extremely during the course of 6 months. That is, around the equinoxes, it moves about 6 times as fast as at the solstices. But it's a very interesting scientific hypothesis represented by by this structure, of which there only remains stumps of the pillars bracketing the apertures. The entire city was sacked and completely obliterated at some point by a conquering power. There is a very, very strong tradition, very old tradition in China about the conferral, about hierophanies, the conferral of the magic of numbers, and so on, by creatures rising from the waters, the rivers, a horse carrying something called the river diagram, and a turtle with the Luo writing. Luo is the name of the river, a tributary of the Yellow River. And here you have an explanation of what this meant. Have been conferred on you, the founder of the first dynasty. He conferred on you the writing that emerged from the river. A sacred turtle bearing a pattern appeared, arrayed on its back with the numbers 9, in particular with 5 at the center. This is a very important figure because it becomes iconic in its own right as the magic square. As you could see, if you add the numbers in any direction, they all total 15. And of course, this was magical at the time. So here we see some classical references to the river diagram, a chart which the rulers all possessed, and that the stars are tallies, the transient effects of the materia vitalis, chi, which I have to explain if you're not familiar with the term. Everything in the cosmos is composed of chi. It is a material essence, but is also animate. So it's very difficult to translate in our terms. It spans everything from the most dense and solid stone to the most evanescent vaporous. Everything is chi. We all are chi. And chi moves through the body, through the world, through the earth and the sky. The stars are chi. There's a whole science of, if you know anything about Chinese medicine and Tai Chi, for example, there's a whole science of Qi and the regulation or the steering of Qi. So stars are transient effects of Qi with regard to their rising and falling, and the vicissitudes, in particular political affairs. They're the most proximate tallies of the interactions between heaven and mankind. Now, where did all this come from? Well, it turns out that it's very likely not a myth, or it's a mythic elaboration of an actual physical occurrence. This is a conjunction of the 5 planets this is the square of Pegasus here, near Alpha Pegasi. In 1953, you can't read it here, 1950. This is the most planets in the past 5,000 years. There has been no such reoccurrence. at this level of compactness, at any rate. The planets, of course, would have traveled along the ecliptic to arrive at this point, passing through the Dragon constellation, which I'll have more to say about, across the Sky River, above the Turtle constellation, to this gathering place south of Ding, south of the square of Pegasus, which is known as Ding, the determiner. This figure will turn up again. This Ding, role of Ding, will turn up again, as will the role of planetary conjunctions. In the text, in the tradition, this occurrence represented the conferral on the first emperor of the Xia dynasty by heaven of a jade scepter of appointment bearing this emblem. And of course, this later becomes, as we saw, the writing that appeared on the back of this turtle in the lower river. At any rate, that's my understanding of this. There you have the date. About 1,500 years later, we have here the canonical formulation of the importance of taking instruction from heaven. Heaven gave birth to the numinous things. The sage takes them as his model. Heaven changes and transforms. The sage emulates it. Confucius, of course, is the most famous sage of historical time. Heaven suspends images manifesting propitious and inauspicious. The sage makes of himself their semblance. Out of the river there emerged a diagram, and from the law there emerged a writing, and the sage takes them as his model. This is sort of the canonical statement of what this means. I said that I'd talk a little bit about the dragon. We'll have more to say about this in a moment. The dragon, as I'm sure you know, is a ubiquitous in Chinese art and figurative design. Here you have simply one representative example among tens of thousands from the Shang dynasty, the last half of the second millennium BC. Here you have representations of, these are forms of the character for the dragon. This is from the Shang dynasty oracle bone divination texts, the first writing that is preserved in China from the second millennium BC. And on the right, an example from a bronze similar to the one that you just saw. Here you see the dragon in the sky, at least the midsection to the tail. Sorry. There's been a lot of debate about the origin of the dragon, where such a mythical creature could have come from. I think it's fairly obvious that it's a very concrete origin. This Yangtze alligator, so-called, was ubiquitous in the north. There's been considerable climate change since the second millennium BC in North China and aridification. And this creature was found everywhere along in the Yellow River Valley. And in particular is their habits, which parallel those of the peasant farmer, right? Plowing the fields in the spring and stocking up on food to take them through the winter and going into hiding in the cold months. Here you have again from 1300 BCE a bronze, and on it, on the side, you have a representation of a dragon and a juxtaposed alligator. So I think it's fairly evident that that is the origin of the mythic creature, the dragon. At its heart is this star, Antares in Scorpius, a reddish-orange star, which is quite bright and served as a seasonal, very important seasonal marker throughout Chinese history to the common folk. Very iconic. We also see it in the Hesiod, for example. And here you have this representation of the dragon from the Han Dynasty with the typical Chinese ball and link representation of constellations. Here, of course, is Scorpius. And I would argue that this raised knob at the center probably represents Antares, the fire star. This is one of my favorite representations of the dragon. Whoops. The expression is priceless. And here you have a picture that makes it very clear that the dragon, the Chinese dragon, is not the scary, fire-breathing, princess imprisoning creature of Western tradition. It's much more a beneficent. It's an awesome creature, capable of awesome power, but it's also not harmful if you pay it respect and keep your distance and so on. It's a benevolent creature. This brings me to a very important point that you'll see repeated again and again. How many of you are familiar with the Book of Changes in any respect? Okay. The Book of Changes is the most famous oracular text. It's in the Chinese canon. It's comprised of 64 hexagrams like this, with solid and broken lines punctured in the middle in alternation. Total of 64, and these hexagrams, their key configurations and their potential changing lines so that they can morph from one hexagram into another, are said to represent all possible events in the universe, in the cosmos, in human society, in the world, in nature, and so on. And so it is it became an oracular text that was consulted. There's a way you manipulate stalks of a particular plant, or even coins. If you read Richard Wilk's translation of the Book of Changes, you'll learn about it. But it's sort of the sine qua non in Chinese philosophical tradition of divinatory wisdom. Each line has a text attached, and These are the texts attached to the very first hexagram, Qian, which is all yang lines. We'll get to yin and yang in a moment. All yang lines. And the yang force, there are two the binary forces of yin and yang. Yang force represents the male principle, yin, the female principle. The male is assertive. The female yin is recessive, more likened to water. The yang is more likened to fire, and so on. And the list goes on interminably of this binary explanation of the cosmos. But this is quintessential yang. And you notice that each of the lines, with one or two exceptions, refers to the dragon. The dragon is hidden, takes no action. And this is interpreted often. If you get this and you're a Chinese scholar and you are contemplating some initiative going into government or something like that, and you get this line after your manipulation, this hexagram and that particular line, then you know that now is not the time. You bide your time until the right moment comes, which might be down here. But the next step is the dragon appears in the fields. Beneficial is the appearance of a great man. Sometimes bounding from out of the void, no blame. The soaring dragon in the sky is beneficial. It's beneficial to observe a great man. And then finally, the obstinate or recalcitrant dragon who will have cause for regret. Now, what is all this hocus pocus about? Well, here you have the horns of the dragon constellation in Virgo. Okay, Spica here, which also plays an important role in Hesiod, works and days, of course, and the whole mythology of Persephone going into the underworld and so on is exactly connected to the behavior of this star. Here you have the rising of the horns above the horizon in February. The dragon appears in the fields, and to this day, every Chinese knows the expression on the second day of the second month, the dragon shows its head. It's amazing, but it's 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and farmers still, to this day, will cite this. I'll move fast through this. Here you have just a representation of the dragon through the summer months. Here it leaps into the void, the horns, and soon the tail will rise. Here you have the whole thing soaring across the sky in the summer at the solstice back in 2000 BC. The summer solstice was around July 11. And then in August, the beginning of autumn, the horns have already disappeared. And this is the imperious or the reluctant dragon. You see how its posture has changed, and it's refusing to set, in a sense, right? But then, look, in the pre-dawn hours, just after the autumn equinox, whoop, here appear the horns again. But now it's pre-dawn. Okay, this is a 75-degree long constellation. Okay, so it's setting on that end, and pre-dawn, the head is popping up already. I won't go any further with this, but there's an important explanation about this as well. Here, the whole thing is in the sky. around the winter solstice. And then in February, in the evening, the horns now appear again, right? So planting season, plowing is to begin. But at the same time, you have the yin dragon still in the sky. Okay, so this explains a line in the next hexagram where you have two dragons. The yin and yang forces are contending, right? The natural course of things is that the yang force, the sun and warmth and the spring rains and so on, should be making its appearance, and the yin force should be receding and being overtaken. You all know this yin yang symbol, right? With the light tadpole-like figure and the dark tadpole-like figure with a bright dot in the dark one and a light dot, and the dots represent the nascent yang and nascent yin, which is always there and reasserts itself at the right moment. Okay, now we move on to astrology. We saw the precedent-setting conjunction of planets in 1953 BC with all of the attendant mystical correlations, the revealing of the secret of numbers and so on, the conferral on the first hereditary dynasty of the rule of the world. This is the next such event. Here you have May of 1059 BC, 900 years later. The five planets gathered once again at the boundary between Cancer and Gemini, in the beak of the vermilion bird. And this is taken as a celestial sign conferring legitimacy on the upstart Zhou dynasty, which overthrew the Shang and then went on to become the most important formative dynasty in ancient China, lasting some 800 years. Of course, there was decline over that time and many difficulties, but all of the classical thought and writing and philosophy and religion and so on really took shape in the Zhou dynasty and set all the precedents for what was to follow. Really interesting about this is that it was interpreted as referring to the Zhou dynasty because the bird, the vermilion bird, which you saw earlier, this part of the sky is connected corresponds in astrology, as we'll see in a moment, with the Zhou. And so it was pretty obvious what the meaning of this event was. Out of this, originally there were probably just 4 quarters of the sky, the 4 palaces of the sky had their representation with terrestrial locations. The system is expanded. Later in Zhou, as I mentioned, I don't want to say, well, I'll have to say feudatories, although the Chinese system was not feudal in a strict sense. But the Zhou relatives who were appointed princes and kings all over the northern China as rulers of statelets gradually grew in power and influence and even challenged the center, the Zhou, and eventually led to its decline and fall. But at the high point of this development, when you have these contending states. All these names are the names of the contending states, all vying to reestablish the centralized power. Here you have the course of the Yellow River, and this is their geographic locations. And here they are as they were understood to correspond to the sky, to the stars in the sky. This is subsequent. This is in the so-called Warring States period, the late first millennium BCE. And so you say, whoops, you see that the Yellow River corresponds to the Milky Way in the sky. So this is sort of a perfect correspondence between the sky and the terrestrial polities, okay? So the identification is so close so that if Jupiter, for example, is in the area of the sky corresponding to, say, the Xu, then the texts will state that it is in the state which corresponds to Xu. It will not even say that it's in such and such a lunar mansion or asterism. It will say it's in that terrestrial state. Okay. So close is the identification. Later, beginning in the early imperial period, there was an attempt, because of the total change in political circumstances, China was unified. These various states were now semi-obsolete. They'd all been conquered and unified. And China was being very strongly challenged by frontier peoples, nomadic frontier peoples who grew very much in power and as a threat. So there was an attempt to redefine the correspondence. This is called field allocation in astrology. And now you have the south and east, fortunately, because that is yang, referring to China, and the north and west referring to barbarians. Okay, and that is the yin territory. During the same period, you have a very interesting process going on concerning this very same asterism, the square of Pegasus. I think I mentioned before that it was called Ding, the determiner, and it now becomes the preeminent way of bringing a north-south line down to the ground. So it is a heaven-conferred geometric primal line, okay? Prime meridian, you might say. And so in texts of the period, you have the instructions how at a particular time of year, when Ding is perpendicular to the horizon, when you can lay out high-value palaces, temples, and so on, those things that have very great, very high political, religious significance. I won't go through this, but I'll just say that the first emperor who unified China in a very brutal process, conquered all of the contending states, established his new capital called Xianyang. He undertook a total revolution of the pre-existing scheme. Now, ran through his capital. Here you have the imperial palace, and here you have across the river the city. It later becomes the capital. Next dynasty, as we'll see. So now, instead of the Yellow River, the axis, it is the Wei River of the Universal Empire. That is sort of the definitive geographic marker. At the same time, you have representations like this of the celestial lord, the so-called Shangdi, the supernal lord, in his chariot at the pole. I should have mentioned earlier that the supreme god, the sky god, dwells at the pole. And the remarkable thing is that through the previous 2,000 years of Chinese civilization, formative civilization, there was no pole star. It was an empty spot. And so that's why you have in some Chinese metaphysical speculation, especially in Taoist thought, such emphasis on the efficacy of the void. The Tao is something that cannot be expressed in language, cannot be described. It is the motivating force of the universe, and it is unseen. There you have simply the Wei River running through, still to this day, Xianyang City. And interestingly, these are all Han Dynasty, the next dynasty, imperial mausoleums, following exactly the same course. All of the earliest emperors of the Han Dynasty are buried there. One other aspect I'll just mention is that running straight through the capital of Xianyang is this Meridian Avenue, as it's called, which runs straight up to Mongolia and does not follow river courses and so on. It goes straight over mountains, and there is no deviation. And the engineering that was required is absolutely mind-blowing. So here we see at the new year in the Qin dynasty, 220, 210 BC, looking south from the ramparts of the palace. In the sky, you have Ding, and remember that this was the location of the conferral of the first imperial dynastic rule, right? With the first 5-planet conjunction, the densest 5-planet conjunction, very same location. And you have the Milky Way running from southwest to northeast, just like the rivers in the astrological scheme. Summing up, I just wanted to point this out. This is particularly interesting. The ritual locus where the emperor carried out his seasonal sacrifices was square and with a round ceiling, with a dome-like ceiling, just as in the current conception at the time of the structure of the cosmos, right? The four directions, four cardinal directions, and the circular or dome-like heaven, sometimes likened to a chariot parasol. Of course, by this time, there was already naysayers pointing out that how do you link the corners of a square Earth with a round heaven? So changes do come about. Anyway, the most important issue here is in the 5th century, you have something that's for all the world, like a planetarium, right? As the seasons turn, this painted sky with starry lunar mansions on it rotates as the emperor conducts his sacrifices. I won't make you read this or all of it. I'll just read one that I think is particularly interesting. There are 3 ideas regarding the structure of the cosmos. The first and earliest archaic is the dome-like heaven, flat, square Earth. Very problematical, as was well understood. Then comes the egg-like shape of the cosmos with the Earth, a not well described yolk in the middle, but not thought to be round, with an empty void and an outer shell. And then you get this, probably the most sophisticated explanation to arise. The heavens are infinitely high, the Earth is unfathomably deep. Above the heavens, the permanent state of rest, the body of Earth remains quiet and motionless. One envelops the other. If the one is square, so is the other. If the one is round, so must the other be. They cannot be. The luminaries are distributed, each pursuing its own course in 9 layers. Like the high and low tides of the sea, and like the thousands of living creatures which sometimes come out and sometimes hide away. I like this because it's so poetic. Of course, this is probably the most important takeaway as regards Chinese metaphysical and social philosophy, is the role of heaven and heaven's de, this influence. Very difficult to translate because at different times it has slightly different implications. Whoops. Prioritization of timeliness and harmonious conformity from phenology, as we saw in the I Ching, for example. You have the progress from what is essentially a farmer's almanac, right? The dragon, and all that's left out is, the observations of the plants and so on, and the insects that appear and disappear during the seasons. And the Chinese have a system of 24 names of fortnights throughout the year, each of which identifies those phenomena. And from this, there's of course, just as in our own day, Farmer's Almanac contains prognostications about the weather to come during the year and so on. So there's a prognostication association with the dragon and the sky, and that's why you get the I Ching as the sort of preeminent oracular text. We mentioned the supernal Lord, the changes. I didn't mention the great one, the monad, the great monad, which is the source of everything, which divides into yin and yang, and later the 5 elemental phases, which characterize each period and which cycle through different lengths of time. but governing the ethos of each period. And then, of course, the parasol like heaven above a square earth, a canonical dogma that stymies further cosmological speculation, but not progress in computational and positional astronomy. By the Song Dynasty, the instruments like this, some of them were clock driven, were accurate to within a half a second of arc. This is also a Song planisphere inscribed on stone in very great detail. And then, of course, the shameless self-promotion, but this is available as a PDF online. So thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. We have now 10 minutes for about 10 minutes for questions. If someone has it, yeah, Sylvia, come.
I had to exit the room just when you started talking about, you know, the various combinations of lines, segments, let's call them segments, that gave a sort of dynamics in the great, how do you call it in Chinese, the book? Yeah, in Chinese, I Ching. So in the book of changes, of course, we have these different combinations. So, and I have to exit the room. I couldn't follow what you said just afterwards. So when I was back, of course, you were showing the different configuration of the dragon in the sky and so on. But I would like first to hear what you said, and then ask you a question.
I'm not exactly sure what you're. Oh. Well, you have to distinguish the demonstration that I gave you of the correspondence between the dragon and the dragon's appearance through the course of the year and the lines of the hexagram. Almost no one in ancient China had that in mind. That is an explanation, my explanation and others, Leopold de Saussure, for example, of how the I Ching likely began as a farmer's almanac, as a sort of astral calendar, but then metamorphosed into this abstract, very abstract understanding of change, of time, and being in step with the moment, that is totally unrelated now to the sky.
So my question is precisely this, because it's a sort of a combinatorial system. I'm insisting so much on segments because there is a passage of PROTEUS Timaeus in which it says that even if he uses triangles as and indicates triangles, let's say, as the basis through which then we can read Tetrahedra as the most important solid constituting the sensible world, or better, arriving at describing the most fundamental element, even if the word element is not to be used in this case, but still there is a very, very there is a passage in which stated that the segment is in reality what is, let's say, the most basic things and the most basic geometrical item is the right word, from which we can derive triangles and tetrahedra in order to. And so I was wondering whether, I'm not saying, of course, that Plato was the influence or was aware of this also, because you know, the time is not on our side. But I'm wondering why they use segments, for example. Why not points? Why not triangles? Why not other things? So there must have been a ground, mathematical ground, a cultural ground. I don't know this. I mean, of course, I'm not an expert. That was justifying the idea of using segments in order to read the dynamic of change. So why does segment is the most basic item in the I Ching in order to describe this dynamic?
The way it's thought to work is that you have this mathematical manipulation using either coins. That's a modern invention. In the past, the Chinese would use 49 stalks of the yarrow plant. And what you do is you take a bunch, you separate them into two a number of times until you have less than 4 remaining. And that number then gives you another number, either 2 or 3. And those numbers, you do this 3 times for each line, and those numbers added up give you either 6 or 9 as the number of the line. 6 is yin and 9 is yang, and then you've got your line, you've got your first line, and then you continue doing that for 6 lines until you get all 6, some yang, some yin. And the whole notion is that in your doing that process, while you are doing that process, you are capturing something about that instant in time. You are sort of sampling the trend of the Tao, of the circumstances of the cosmos, everything included at that very moment. And the information it gives you, the reference to a line, or first to a hexagram that it gives you, when you go to that hexagram, it, with interpretation, it will tell you what action is appropriate and what is inappropriate at this moment in time. So it all has to do with an instant capturing, you know, all of the forces at work in the cosmos at that instant, the instant that may impinge on any action that you take. And the idea is to always, it's kind of a mechanical way of doing it. There's philosophers don't approve. There's another sort of meditative, philosophical way of arriving at the same understanding of how the Tao is moving at any given moment and how you should stay in harmony with it. But it's all about the same principle of knowing how to act at a given moment in time.
For the second question, I would ask if you have other questions or no? Yes, so 3, so please be quick in questions and answers.
Hi, thank you for the talk. This is a question from basic ignorance, but I was curious throughout at various points, the basic question of who was doing this work, why were they doing it, and what was sort of their status. So to make it concrete, there's the example of the observatory for, measuring horizon with the aperture. So do you have an understanding of who built that, why they built that, what their status was? And, that's a concrete instance, but it was sort of throughout your talk, I'm curious about who was doing the astrology and the cosmology.
Well, if you remember the Puyang burial that I showed you, that Cosmo priest, that's the figure that was throughout Chinese history. He then becomes the scribe astrologer who records the precedents, okay, of omens and everything of that sort, and offers advice to the ruler as to what the meaning is. And this goes all the way through China up to the 20th century. There is a distinct separation between computational astronomy and positional astronomy that has to do with mainly with the calendar, with correcting the calendar, keeping the calendar accurate, because the emperor's calendar is indicative of his legitimacy. If it's screwed up, that means he's out of step with the powers that be in the sky. There's a whole other department of scribe astrologers who observe and interpret and report to the court on the meaning of anomalous events like the Crab supernova in 1054. So these are there's pretty much a bulkhead between them. The scribe astrologers, and that whole office was for a long time hereditary. If you were in that office, you couldn't transfer to any other office, and the texts that they used, the prognostication texts that they used, were proscribed. They could not be distributed.
Thank you very much for that. I was a bit puzzled of the way changes and stability in the sky are sometimes emphasized in what you said. So in the book of changes, the way you interpreted it, actually, as this almanac, it's interesting that it's called Book of Changes because it seems to be actually a repetition of the years. Get it in Hesiod. On the other hand, if I understood correctly, but I may have missed that, you said in Taoism there's this emphasis on the void because there was for 2,000 years or something like this no polar star. So then they must have been aware that before that there was one, and then at a certain point it wasn't to be seen. So I'm just wondering whether they thought of this then also as a longer cycle, also something that reoccurs again, or whether there's a, so to say, permanent change.
Number one, they had no idea that there was ever a pole star before their own time. The pole was empty for the whole formative period of Chinese civilization. No, if you look up and it's black and there's no bright star there and there is never a bright star there, it's empty. Yes, but this is the spot in the sky around which everything else turns. So the speculation is about what is the motivating force that is controlling all of this if there's nothing there. Oh yeah, oh yes, yes. And that's why the emperor, the supernal lord, is depicted in his carriage driving around that spot, right? As far as timelessness and so on, that spot and that principle and how the cosmos operates, that's what's timeless. But change is the most important aspect that impacts humanity, right? How to adapt to changes. whether it's, the agricultural season or, political organization, governance, political governance, how to organize a society in accord with this principle of, this influence, this supposedly, possibly benevolent influence of the supernal Lord in the sky. But then, of course, you get divination, because not always, bad things happen, and you have to explain it. And it's explained as, we messed up. We did something wrong. And so traditionally throughout Chinese history, if there was a true catastrophe, the emperor would have to proclaim a mea culpa. I'm sorry, it's all my fault. We will reform, we will make necessary changes. I'm really sorry, it won't happen again.
Okay, many thanks.